Okay, let me close the door.
Up to you. Everybody's looking.
Okay. We'll get started now. I guess get started. It's recording. Okay. So.
بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. أما بعد, السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So thanks for coming. I know it's week 5, so a lot of you guys are busy. So I appreciate the time to just an hour or so. We're going to go over the 5th lecture for the Seerah class. So kind of just to summarize what we've gone over so far, right? We've basically set up the landscape in the world to which the Prophet ﷺ came to, right? So part of that was sort of understanding the akhlaq and kind of the mannerisms and the characteristics of the Prophet ﷺ, right? We knew that in early Islam, right, or even before Islam, he was known as Sadiq al-Amin, right? Because the Quraysh would literally trust him with their very personal affairs and belongings, right? And we also saw from his marriage to Khadija and also the story of Zayd ibn Haritha, how he sort of treated his people and his family and relationships and things like that, right? So we kind of see what kind of a person he truly was, right? Now, the other thing that we also kind of went over was the religious and the political landscape of Arabia at the time, right? So we knew that we saw the Jahiliyyah at the time and how there was no true person that really worshipped Allah alone, right? So there was a need for a prophet at the time, right? And kind of the topic of today's lesson is going to be about the beginning of the revelation, right? So it's kind of leading up to the events that we all know, where the angel Jibreel came to the Prophet ﷺ and started the Iqra revelation and things like that. But before this actually happened, there were some things that the Prophet ﷺ sort of began to undergo, almost like a transformation that led up to these events, right? And it's from Aisha radiallahu anha that we sort of get the most vivid recollection of how the story of prophethood began, right? So it was from her who narrated her vivid detail that we get a lot of the points of how revelation exactly started, right? So we all know about the Ghat Hira, the cave of Hira, right? So that's where the Prophet ﷺ was coming up to the revelation, where the Prophet ﷺ would literally take himself out of society, meditate, contemplate about what is true Tawheed, right? What is the true religion? Because he knew his people weren't on that true religion, right? So this cave is at the top of Jabal al-Nur. At the time, it was just an ordinary mountain, probably outside of Mecca, because Mecca was probably like the size of the Haram nowadays. It's a lot bigger today because the city grew and there's so many more people that are in it. So he would literally take himself out of society and go to a cave and begin to contemplate and worship Allah alone, right? And also, kind of just like a tidbit is that like this mountain's like pretty massive. It takes like an hour or two, and that's these days where it's like there's like nice like trails and stuff like that because it's been like trailblazing and things like that, right? But at his time, it was a decently treacherous like thing, So it was not an easy journey. So what he would do is like he would go for a couple days, nights, some period of time. He'd bring with him dates and water and just basic food. And from there, he would spend days until the food expires. And then he would come back to Khadija, kind of take care of any of his personal. Right. So this sort of venture out to the Ghat Hira and come. It went on for some period of time, right? And one of the other things that Prophet ﷺ also began to notice was there were some things that he would he began to realize was happening to him, right? And these are from like the unseen world, right? Where it's like an ordinary person would kind of be like, well, what is happening to me? Because the thing is like prophethood is not like an easy thing, right? We say that he became a prophet overnight, but really what it entails is that you're dealing with like unseen things, right? You're dealing with things of not this nature, not of this world's nature, So it takes mental fortitude and mental stability to be able to kind of take in these types of things, right? So amongst those things were that in an authentic hadith, he would say that the rocks and the stones would actually start saying salam to him, right? So as he's walking in the path, he'd hear a salam, but he'd look around and there's nobody there, you know? So if this was anybody else, you'd think that like, it's kind of going like a little crazy, you know? But the rocks would literally, and he would say, there's an authentic hadith that says, he recognizes one of the stones which would always say salam to him, no matter what. He knew what the stone was even after the Prophet had come, right? So, and amongst the things that he also kind of experienced was that every single night he would have a true dream, and this dream would literally become reality the next day, right? So it's as if like he has the dream, and as we know, the sun is going to rise the next day. He sees that dream come into fruition exactly as it is, right? So he talks to Khadija about this. He's like, I've been seeing dreams. I'm kind of seeing these things. The rocks and stones are saying salam to me, and he's just like, I don't know what's happening to me, right? So the Prophet ﷺ at this time did not even know he was going to reveal or get revelation, right? This was something that was going to be completely new to him. But Khadija, in her wisdom, had basically said this is a good sign from Allah, right? Because these are good things that happen, good dreams. When you have visions of the future and things like that, right? It's like Allah's gift to you. Even to this day, dreams are actually one of the forms of wahy, of revelation, right? And that form is still open to us today if we're righteous enough. May Allah, make us amongst those who experience true dreams, right? So this period went on for 6 months or so before the cave of Hira, right? So yeah, and kind of this is like kind of tangential to dreams and things like this since we're talking about them, but there's like 3 different types of dreams that we all experience, right? So the first is that it's dreams from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And these dreams are of those that make us good or bring a good feeling, when we see them. They typically are views of the future, can be, and they could also just be like, like as we see in Prophet Yusuf's story, right? Dreams that have some symbols and stuff like that, and they are interpreted to mean something, right? And these types of dreams are those that are good and they bring about a good feeling, and they never really like terrify or anything like that, right? And we actually remember them, right? Now, the second type of dream is that there are dreams from the shaitan, which are designed to literally like they're what we call nightmares. We wake up in like cold sweats and things like that. And these kinds of dreams are literally designed to like the shaitan uses them to scare us into doing certain things, right? So when we see like a nightmare or something like that, we are taught to basically like ignore it, not tell anybody about it, and move on from it, right? Because it's shaitan's way of acting to try to get us to act in some type of manner, And the last one is dreams from our own imagination, these are the types of dreams that's like when you wake up, you remember like I was having such a good dream, and you don't remember what the dream was, right? So if like for example, like if I want a really nice car, I dream I'm gonna drive that car in the dream, and it's not like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is like telling me the next day I'm gonna drive that car, right? Because we forget the dream even happened. So that's like the third class of dreams, and all of these dreams are one form of revelation, right? Like I said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still has that open to mankind today, right? But as I mentioned, why is the Prophet ﷺ sort of going through all these things, right? Why is he experiencing true dreams, and why is he hearing the stones and rocks say salam, right? And as I mentioned already, becoming a prophet requires psychological, mental, and spiritual training, right? So that is what Allah is kind of making him go under. And it's because the prophet receiving revelation is actually like a physically demanding task, right? And it's requires you to be of like incredibly sound mind, right? Because when we're dealing with things of the unseen, right? I mean, like we know people get super superstitious when they hear like some wind or a thing, right? But if they see angels, if they see the unseen world, right? It takes a lot for humans to kind of be able to handle that, right? And we'll see, like even when the Prophet ﷺ saw Jibreel, right? It was something that he was not ready for, right? Even through all this training, he still became terrified, as we'll get into, right? And before we get into like the story of Ghar Hira, there's kind of a benefit that we can get from how the Prophet ﷺ used to worship alone, right? Because it's no longer a sunnah for us to like seek caves and crevices and these types of things and worship alone, right? No, nothing in Islam tells us that we need to like sit alone in a cave for days on end, just worshiping Allah alone, right? But there is some notion of like of worshiping in solitude, right? And one of the things I think we can all benefit from is that like worshiping in solitude sort of purifies all of our deeds, right? And there's a very famous hadith about the people who will be shaded on the day of judgment, right? And amongst those people are two: a man who gives in charity and conceals it to such an extent that the left hand does not know what the right has given, and then there be also the person who remembers Allah in solitude in his eyes of Allah, right? So as I mentioned, like we don't have this notion of we need to go to the wild and sit alone and contemplate, right? But Islam encourages us to take in our moments of worshiping alone, right? And I speak for myself first and foremost, right? There's benefits, like we all know the benefits of the tahajjud, of being awake at night and praying and things like that, right? And also it sort of combats this thing called riyah, which is the idea of doing good deeds to sort of impress people, right? And may Allah protect us all from this, because it's something that's really dangerous, right? And even the Prophet ﷺ used to make dua that Allah protects himself from this, right? And obviously the Prophet ﷺ is perfect. He can't fall into any of these things, right? But he makes these sort of things, he does these sort of things so that he sees like the importance of it, right? Like he would ask for forgiveness 100 times a day. Why? I think it was Aisha. She asked him, "Why do you do this?" Because you are forgiven. You're entering the limit of the Prophet. You're not going to be going to. You're going to Jannah no matter what, right? But it's so that we can see him asking for forgiveness, and now it's like, okay, he's asking for forgiveness. What about us? So it's the same type of thing. This concept of riyah, which is like to sort of impress people, is considered to be like a minor form of shirk, right? Because you're doing things not for the sake of Allah, but you're going to be doing things, good deeds for people, right? And sort of the thing is that like people, like a person can be worshiping for like 60, 70, 80 years their whole life. And on the day of judgment, they'll show up empty handed because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will say, you did this not for my own sake, but you go to the people who you try to. But the way that the scholars say to basically like combat this and fight this, right? It's super simple, right? And the idea is that the worship you do in solitude and alone purifies that which you do in public, right? So it's like, for example, they say like when you donate, like let's say you're at a masjid or something and you raise your hand and you donate, or even like charity week, right? If we start fearing, and this is also fearing this type of thing is also a sign of a believer, right? And show that your heart is alive, that you fear Allah and His punishment, right? So basically, if we are afraid of this, we purify that which we donate by donating in private, right? Our salah, whatever we do in public, we increase it when we're private, right? And with this, it's like a fortress, Now you're protected from, oh, I'm not doing this for the sake of people because I do it in private anyways, where there's nobody, like, I can't be doing it for anybody but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So that is like kind of one of the things that we can get from why the Prophet ﷺ sought solitude, right? And at his time it was because there was no notion of revelation. He didn't have instructions on how to worship or anything like that. So he did his best, right? He was sincere in his attempts to try to worship Allah, right? And so coming back to the story of Jibreel, so while the Prophet ﷺ was in Ghar Hira, we know that the revelation came down on a Monday, because in authentic hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, he was asked about why he always fasted on Monday, and he said, on it I was born, and on it the revelation was also the first day of revelation that it was sent down, right? So it was on a Monday in Ramadan that the risala, that the prophethood basically started, right? So inside the cave, we all know the story, right? I'm sure the Jibreel came to the Prophet ﷺ and grabbed him super tightly to the point where the Prophet ﷺ literally like he lost all energy with him and he thought he was gonna die, right? So like as if like if you're being choked, it's very quick to like if if you're kind of choked from the neck, very easy. Like you start like literally losing all energy and you start like seeing black, right? But Prophet ﷺ, then this figure, this being, suddenly told him Iqra, right? And the Prophet ﷺ said, I can't read because he was illiterate. He didn't know how to read nor write, right? And this repeated 3 times, right? He would squeeze him incredibly tight, and then he would the being would tell him Iqra, and then again he would squeeze him really tight until finally the first 5 verses of Surah Alaq are revealed, right? Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم, right? And kind of one of the reasons why maybe the Jibreel had squeezed him so tightly was to indicate to the Prophet ﷺ that this is not like a dream, or this is like reality. Like when people say, I think I'm dreaming, you kind of pinch yourself to see if you're really dreaming or whatever. This is what they do in like movies and things like that, so it's to kind of indicate to the Prophet ﷺ that this is reality and this is a real being that's physically in front of you, right? So, but because he doesn't know what's going on, he is sort of in a dark cave, and suddenly this being starts telling him to read from what he doesn't know, right? So he becomes incredibly terrified, right? We'll get into that later, but there's some benefits that we can get from the first 5 verses of Surah Al, right? And the first is Iqra, right, which is to literally read. The Arabic of it is you can either read. It means to read from memory and to read from like memorization, right? So it's to recite from books and to recite from the hearts, and right. So the first verse, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, means read in the name of Allah, right? The Lord who created what? خلق الإنسان من علق. Like man from a clinging substance, right? So he's telling the Prophet ﷺ, read from what your Lord, the Creator, is going to recite to you, right? What is he going to recite to you? The message of the Quran is just the message of Allah, right? The message, worship Allah alone, be good to others, etc., etc. So this is the first Iqra that the Prophet ﷺ is being commanded to, right? Read in the name of Allah, right? Now the second Iqra, there's another Iqra wa rabbuka al-akram alladhi allama bil qalam, right? Recite, and your Lord is the most generous, who taught man who taught man how to use the pen, right? And this literally means like how to write and things like that, right? Okay. Anyways, yeah. So sorry, I got to start. Okay. So the second Iqra literally means read from what people have already studied, right? From what man has like taught and stuff like that. It means Allah is commanding us, go out and seek knowledge not only of religion but also of the world, right? And that's what we're all doing at university, right? University is a fundamentally like Islamic thing, right? The first universities that were founded in the world were Morocco, were Baghdad, were Andalus, right? All these places were centers of education, right? And there was literally people coming from everywhere to kind of begin studying and things like that, right? We all know algebra. Algebra was invented by a Muslim, right? So education and knowledge of this world, we are literally being commanded for it, right? It comes down from this revelation, right? So what happens is that the Prophet ﷺ, okay, before I get into that, actually, kind of one thing I was kind of reflecting on, and we always take for granted, is actually like the idea of language and writing and things like that, right? Because the things I'm saying actually are just really voices or sounds that my vocal box is like making, right? But you guys are like processing it, and converting that into like things that we understand, right? So this in of itself is a miracle, and we ask ourselves like, who was the first person to teach? Like who's the first person to start speaking, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taught the Prophet Idris. He was the first person to start writing. Had Allah not taught Adam how to speak, we would not be able to speak like this, right? And all the knowledge that has been gained over like scientific and religious, everything, right? It is out of the mercy of Allah that He kind of gave us the ability to gain this knowledge and gain this the ability to make these types of discoveries, right? So those are just some benefits from Iqra. And after the Prophet ﷺ had seen Jibreel, and he actually saw Jibreel in his true form, when he had seen Jibreel, he saw that Jibreel had taken the entire horizon, right? And he had 600 wings. And so he was pretty terrified, right? He was running back home to Khadija because his heart was literally palpitating, and he was genuinely scared for himself because he sees this figure and he doesn't know what this figure is and that he's even becoming a prophet, right? So the kind of the lesson is after he went back to Khadija, he just tells Khadija, cover me up, because he's afraid for himself, right? So this also goes to show that the revelation itself, in of itself, was actually completely unexpected, right? And this also goes to show one of the proofs of his prophethood is that you see these from other religions and things like that, right? There's the stories of the religious figures are grandiose, and they came from like common, I don't even know, like there's some crazy stories, especially from like the sort of more pagan traditions. Our Prophet ﷺ, on the first day of revelation, went back to his wife, right, and consulted her, right, because he was genuinely terrified, which shows his humanity, right? So when we see this, we see the humanity within him, and also even further down the line, right? He had the ability to live like a complete king, right? He had the power, he had the money, he had everything. He had it, and he made dua. He could have also just asked Allah to destroy his enemies, But he chose to live an incredibly simple life because he knows that there's more beyond this life, right? Because that there's going to be something beyond this, and that he's really only doing it for the sake of Allah, right? So he runs back to Khadija, and he basically tells Khadija, I'm fearing for myself, right? He thinks like he doesn't know what's happening to him because who would? He doesn't know what prophethood is, and this is not something that the Arabs had known at the time. Right? The last prophet that was sent to them was Ibrahim, as we mentioned last week or a couple of weeks ago, right? But Khadija replied, like never, by Allah, Allah will never disgrace you, for you keep good relations with your relatives, you speak the truth, you help the poor and the destitute, you serve your guests generously, and you help the deserving, calamity afflicted people, right? So Khadija is literally telling him, like swearing by Allah, there cannot, like what do you have to worry about? Because you are such a righteous person, Allah will not forsake you, Allah will not send something to harm you or anything like that, right? So from this, we actually gain a really important like lesson, right? And this is from Khadija, who, without any prophethood, without like this was the first day of prophethood, right? We learned that as long as you're sincere and righteous, Allah will never forsake you and will always take care of all of your affairs, right? And we saw this example time and time again, right? With Waraqa, who was, as we mentioned last week, he was a Hanif and he was righteous, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala admitted him into Jannah, right? And then Zayd bin Amr bin Nufayl, right? And even the mother of Musa, right? All these people were born right before the prophethood, their respective prophets had started. But Allah praised them to an extent because they were righteous, they were sincere people, right? So this shows the sincerity. As long as you're sincere towards Allah, Allah will take care of all of your affairs, So again, as when the Prophet ﷺ returned back to or the Prophet ﷺ returned back to Khadija, Khadija took her to her cousin Waraqa because he was a Christian and he had studied Jewish books and Christian books and things like that. So he is familiar with the concepts of prophet, right? So she's like, okay, he might know what is going on here. So basically, Waraqa replies and tells them this is an-namus, which translates to the keeper of secrets, whom Allah had sent to Musa. I wish I was young and could live until the time when your people would drive you out, right? So he was at this time he was already an old man. So he wished that he could stay for basically support the Prophet ﷺ, but he was not able to because he had died shortly after it. But the Prophet ﷺ was actually kind of shocked because he was not familiar with the concept of like being expelled from his land, right? Because at the time the Arabs, they were very tribal, and you didn't really leave your village or your area, It was sort of like you just stayed there for your whole life. And because they took their tribe and their blood very seriously, right? So he asked, like, will they drive me out? And then Waraqa replies, like, there has not been a single prophet that has not been rejected, persecuted, and expelled. And you're not going to be the first exception, right? So that's why he literally wished that I could stay with you so that way I can support you when this time comes. But the Prophet ﷺ, sort of, or he passed away shortly after, right? So that's the first revelation. And yeah, so some time had gone by between this and when the Prophet ﷺ received the second revelation, right? And scholars sort of, there's some like differences of opinion, but most popular will just say it's a period of 40 days that passed, right? And the Prophet ﷺ sort of began to become eager again because he wanted to see Jibreel again, right? He wanted to he would literally go out to Jabal Nur and try to see if the Jibreel would appear again. And he would go every single day, only to never find him there, right? Up until he was going about his day. And while he was walking, I'll just read the hadith. While I was walking, all of a sudden I heard a voice from the sky, right? So he starts to hear his name being called, and if he looks right, he looks left, and he's alone he's alone, right? So it's naturally like we're not going to look up to see who's calling us, right? Because normally we're going to expect some person to call us. But when he looks up, he sees a throne, and this was a throne of Jibreel, and he was somewhere between the sky and the earth, right? So similar to what he went through during Iqra, he became scared again, and he's terrified. This also just goes to show, even though he was seeking, he wanted to see Jibreel again, right? He was not ready to see him again, right? Because it's just sort of our finite minds can't like comprehend the unseen world, and also it's like goes to show it's a mercy. It's really a mercy from Allah that He makes us not able to like see angels and jinn and these kinds of things, because we will not be able to like take it all in. Our minds can only handle so much, right? So the Prophet ﷺ becomes terrified again and begins to run back to Khadija again, right? And again he tells Khadija, "Cover me up, cover me up." And this time Jibreel follows him back to his home. And this is where the first couple verses of Surah Al-Mudaththir start, right? Ya ayyuha al-mudaththir, qum fa'anzir, wa rabbuka fakabbir, wa thiyabaka fatahhir, wa rujza fahdud, wa la tamnun tastakthir. Right? Ya ayyuha al-mudaththir. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "Oh, you who's covered up." Right? Covered up meaning he's wrapped in like a blanket because he has Khadija out of fear, right? And the second verse is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically telling him, start to preach the message of Islam, right? It means qum fa'anzir, arise and warn everybody, right? So now the Prophet ﷺ is being given the command to start telling the people of what Islam is, right? Start inviting people, right? And through this, he tells Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells him what you need to be doing. Worship Allah alone, right? This is the number one rule in Islam, right? Like, especially even when we're giving dawah and stuff, the first thing that we tell people is tawheed, that we worship only Allah and Allah alone, right? Stand up, purify your garments, and this means both physically and also internally, right? You want to make sure that you purify the outside and the inside, right? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the Prophet you're going to be delivering a heavy message, and obviously, when you're delivering something, anything really, you have to look good. You have to present yourself. You have to be clean and things like that. So that way, people will accept you, right? And also, it goes to show, like, the scholars say it means to purify one's inside as well, right? So clean yourself from sins, clean yourself from all that is harmful, and only do that which is pleasing to Allah. And then now, with this, the Prophet ﷺ begins to preach people, right? What religious effect do it, right? And this means to shun the idols, get rid of them, and tell the Quraysh to abandon these false gods, right? And this translates to do not do a favor, expecting a return, right? So because a lot of the time, this is what kind of people say about religion, right? Especially non-Muslims. They always say like, the idea of religion is for people to kind of control and to gain power and to gain influence, right? And we can see this, right? Especially with some of these other religions, right? Especially with Catholicism and the Roman Church, right? During this time, they literally asked, like, one of the doctrines was you had to pay your way to get into paradise. You pay your way to get into heaven. and they became filthy rich off of this. And at the time, the poor people who were the primary people, they would literally give up their whole life savings to just kind of achieve this salvation, right? But when we look at the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, Allah Subhanahu wa Taala is telling the Prophet, like, you're not going to be, do not expect a reward for anything related to Islam, right? And this is why Allah Subhanahu wa Taala made zakat, for example, haram upon the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. He can't accept zakat because otherwise he's benefiting from the idea of zakat, right, of charity. And the whole principle is that the Prophet ﷺ is telling the people, I'm not seeking your provision. I'm just a warner to you. Allah is going to provide the provision for me, right? So that's kind of why Allah Subhanahu wa Taala tells him, do not expect favors back for this, right? Do it only for the sake of Allah Subhanahu wa Taala. And it also goes to show that this is sort of the proof of his prophethood, right? That he is a true prophet, because as I mentioned earlier, like, he had every single opportunity to become wealthy and to live with power, right? But at every corner he chose to live a simple life, right? One time a Sahaba saw the mat of like the bed of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, right? And it was basically just like some palm leaves on the floor. And he saw that Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's back was like scratched and marked up, and because he's sleeping on a rough bed. And there was another time that I think a Sahabi sort of made the bed a little bit more comfortable without the Prophet ﷺ knowing, right? And he missed the Hajj because of it. So he got rid of he's like, appreciate it, but I'm gonna go back to what my old bed was.
Who said that? Did that?
Huh?
Who did that?
I forgot the name.
Oh, there's Hafsa.
Hafsa, yeah.
I thought you said Jabin.
No, not you. I forgot. Yeah. Thank you for giving me the name. But this goes to show that there is there's truth to it, right? Because we know, like, these days, power corrupts, right? When one group of people is oppressed, the next thing you know, they're going to be the people oppressing people, right? The Prophet ﷺ lived such a simple life that he knew there's something bigger coming, and that his intention was truly only for the sake of Allah, right? And this is exactly what this verse is telling us. Do not expect a favor from people, right? Do not remind people of favors, right? When you do good, just let it be, right? Don't remind people of the favors that you do to them, because then otherwise you're kind of expecting a favor in return and things like that, right? So it just goes to show that the message that he came with is true, right? And the last verse that came down during this revelation was وَلِرَبِّكَ فَاصْبِرْ, right? And persevere for the sake of the Lord, right? Because Allah Subhanahu wa Taala is basically telling the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam that this mission is not going to be easy. There's going to be a ton of hardships, and you will experience calamities left and right. But when you do it for the sake of Allah and Allah alone, you will become these calamities will be nothing, right? Because you understand that there's something bigger than what these calamities are, right? And we see this time, especially nowadays, right? With what's going on in Palestine, Sudan, every Uyghurs, Kashmir, there's so many oppressed Muslims, but the only thing that is sort of keeping their iman is so strong because they know that there's something bigger than this life, right? This life is dirt, it's dust, literally, the 2 rak'ah before Fajr, this is the authentic hadith. 2 rak'ah before Fajr is worth more than every single thing that comes in. Like, if you gathered everything, all of creation, it's nothing compared to that, right? And also there's another narration, I think it's a hadith, that basically says that had the idea of la ilaha illallah, there's literally the testimony. If you put that on a scale, and everything in creation, so including the 7 heavens, everything in the 7 heavens and the 7 earths, la ilaha illallah would outweigh it, right? So the dunya is nothing, right? And the Prophet ﷺ knew this, and within this verse, he's basically saying, just persevere, because what is going to come is far better than anything that you will endure in this world, right? So with this, now the Prophet ﷺ, he starts to think, okay, now I have a mission and I'm going to start it, right? So we're going to get into this more next week with Mehdi, I think. You? Okay. So the closed dawah begins, right? So the closed dawah basically means is that Islam right now is basically it's an infantile state, right? It's very small and they're weak, right? The number of Muslims is very small, and that's not to say the quality, but I'm going to talk about the quality of the early converts. But the way that the Prophet ﷺ's strategy was to sort of begin in stages, right? So first, he's just going to start with close family, close friends, people that he thinks will have a high chance of converting, and then he's gonna move on to then okay, I'm gonna start inviting my community, and then he moves on to the next stage, which is then he's gonna go to other tribes and other people, and then so on and so forth up until we know with the conquest of Mecca, then Islam became they use military power to sort of expand the reaches of Islam, right? So in this closed dawah, he would only he carefully selected who he thought would be good to invite to Islam, right? Among the first converts was Khadija. As you know, obviously, she was the first convert who, as the Prophet ﷺ ran to her. There's Waraqa, Abu Bakr, and Ali ibn Abu Talib, and also Zayd ibn Haritha. So all these are amongst the very first converts. And inshallah, next week they're going to go into like the stories of these early converts, right? But one thing that we can kind of learn from them is that everybody in this early stage of conversion became legendary, right? Like, they became monuments of Islam, and their iman literally shook mountains, right? There was a hadith that says that the one time the Prophet ﷺ was with Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman, and on Uhud. And Uhud, if you've been there, it's massive. Right? It's like it's not even just a single mountain; it's a range of mountains. And the mountain shook with them. And the Prophet ﷺ said to the mountain, "Be firm, O Uhud, for on you there are no more than a prophet, a siddiq, and two martyrs." Right. So these people their iman was so strong, it took down it would literally shake mountains. But that's because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had to choose people who would be able to bear the message of Islam in the early phase, right? Because especially when we're in this early stage, you can't have people that are weak. You need people that are going to be able to carry the banner of Islam up until it becomes established as a power, right? And as we'll get into, it was a period of like intense persecution and violence, right? They really, it was a really difficult time, and becoming Muslim was not like an easy task, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sort of chose the best of the best for this mission, and that's why the Sahaba are also the best of the best, right? They're the best generation, and we also learned so much about Iman and things like that, right? So yeah, that's pretty much all I had. If there are any questions, I can answer. Otherwise, Jazakallah khair. All good comes from Allah, and any mistakes come from me. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And I want to call this. Go for it.